Good morning, everyone, and thank you very much for joining us for our webinar this morning. I am just going to wait for a few moments to make sure that everybody is in the room. Okay, so my name is Kristine Scott. I'm the Head of Education and a partner at Harrison Clark Rickerbys. I would like to welcome you all to our webinar this morning. I should say that when we decided to hold this webinar, probably around 10 days ago, we knew there was a phased, wider opening of schools on the cards for June. We had no idea how much guidance there would be this week on schools and also the F word furlough. So like us, you are probably waist deep in government guidance, and I'm really hoping that today we can answer a number of your questions. I'm delighted today to be joined by my colleagues, Rachel Parkin and Paul Watkins. Rach is going to look at staff issues, including the F word, and Paul will look at data protection concerns. I'm then going to look at education more widely and look at some of the issues that are in the latest guidance. So a big focus on class sizes, risk assessments, etc. After each speaker slot, I hope we have time for a couple of questions, and there will be a Q&A at the end. Please use the Q&A function, not the chat, to pose your questions. We've got a number of questions submitted in advance, but please use that Q&A function. We know you're all there, so imagining you talking to us. We will endeavour to answer them all. Any that we can't, we will send out the answers, or we don't get time to, we will send out the answers afterwards. So without further ado, I'm delighted to introduce Rach Parkin. She's a partner in our team, an employment specialist with a sole focus on schools. So over to you, Rach.
Good morning, everyone. As Chrissy's mentioned, I'm going to spend a little bit of time talking to you about practical issues from a staffing perspective, which schools will need to consider as part of any return in June and beyond. The main areas I'm going to cover today are health and safety considerations, some of the key staffing issues you're likely to come across, and finally some thoughts on cost savings and your workforce going forward. I won't be too prescriptive in what I say because inevitably your settings and circumstances will differ, but what I'll try to do is give you a checklist of issues to consider, some of which will be more relevant to you than others. So in order to get our employees back to work, we of course need to be confident that it is safe to do so. As an employer, the school has a duty to take reasonable care of the health and safety of its employees and must take reasonable steps to ensure that the environment in which they work is safe. The first way in which you can evidence that what you're doing is reasonable is by following the government guidance. And as Chrissy said, I'm sure you're all now familiar with the reams of guidance that's been issued this week. Who knows what's going to change while we're on this webinar. First and foremost, if you haven't done so already, you'll have to carry out a risk assessment, or at least refresh your risk assessment in light of the recent government advice. The assessment should directly address risks associated with coronavirus so that sensible measures can be put in place to control those risks for staff and of course pupils, and protective measures can be identified before the full reopening. You'll need to record that risk assessment in writing and keep it under review. Now, I'm going to say this a lot throughout my session, so I apologise now, but communication is key. I recommend that you be open and transparent with staff about the school's proposals, as open and as transparent as possible, really, with regards to the specific safety measures you're thinking about. So I'm thinking things like timetable changes, staggered arrival and departure times. Talk to your staff about it, and in fact the government has suggested that risk assessment should ideally be carried out in consultation with staff and trade unions. We are producing an FAQ note on the specific health and safety requirements, and we will be issuing that shortly, so you will be able to have a look at that. Whilst any changes you make are likely to look different in each setting, as they'll obviously depend upon your individual circumstances, they are all, of course, designed to minimise the risks to staff and pupils and obviously anybody who visits school site. It's still important to reduce contact between children and staff as far as possible. I know that's going to be difficult. And we're all familiar with the 2-metre rule now, so you will need to consider what steps you need to take in order to achieve this. Where possible, you should ensure that staff and pupils mix in a small group and keep that small group away from others as much as you can. So you'll have to consider practical issues such as the flow of staff in school. Think about entrances, exits. Can staff access the classrooms from their car park? Maybe you could implement a one-way system, stickers on the floor, that sort of thing. Limit the number of staff members in communal areas. So I'm thinking staff rooms, toilets, kitchens, that sort of thing, so that you have a limited number in at any one time. Obviously, it's going to be more difficult for you with schools that are smaller, so people with schools with narrower corridors, but you just need to have a look at it and assess the risks and see what you can do in the circumstances. With regards to PPE, as you may be aware, the government guidance suggests that wearing a face mask or a face covering is not recommended. I'm kind of pleased that they clarified this in one way, because I could see questions arising following the general government guidance earlier on in the week regarding face coverings in enclosed spaces. So you shouldn't require staff to wear face coverings. That said, in certain circumstances, it may well be required. For example, school nurses, or in situations where personal care may be required. Of course, unions are not very happy about the issue of PPE. They don't agree that it's not needed. I think first of all, they were kicking up a fuss about cost, and then now it's obviously that it's not needed. But we'll have to watch this space and see how it develops. Next slide, please. Communication is key, as I've said, and keep talking to your staff. It's really important to keep that lines of communication open about the reopening and the planning, and discuss any concerns that they have. You will need to determine which staff you need in school and when, and I'm sure you're already starting to think about that now. It is likely that you'll require your full workforce to return, require your full workforce to return all at once, particularly maybe those in a support staff role. You might not need everybody back at the same time. I understand that some schools have sent out emails this week to parents to understand whether they intend to send their child back to school in June, to give them a better idea about how many pupils are likely to come back, so that they can better assess staffing requirements. And it may be a good idea to have a think about that if you haven't done so already. You will need to have a think about content and timing of those staff communications as well, because it might be that you need to bring some staff back in advance of the June opening. You could also need to think about a combination of classroom teaching and online teaching to manage the phased reopening. But in the end, you need to take the approach that best suits your pupils and your staff. The framework, the government framework, talks about considering your options if necessary staffing levels can't be maintained, and it helpfully talks about people like school leaders, key staff like designated safeguarding leads, and first aid providers. So you just need to check that you've got everybody that you need to have back at work. The government guidance says support staff may be drawn on in the event that there are teacher shortages, so it's something to bear in mind. They'd have to work under the direction of other teachers in the setting, but it's something to think about if you are struggling. And where possible, if you can ensure that the same teacher and other staff are assigned to each group of students, pupils, as far as possible, and that these stay the same during the day and on subsequent days, then that will be the best thing to do. Obviously, it could be tricky, and particularly if you've got things like job shares, you'll have to think about how you can manage it. It might be that one of the job shares works with one lot of pupils part of the week and the other part of the week. Now, a question we've been asked a few times in recent weeks is, what happens if staff are unable to return to work because they're shielding or because they're vulnerable? Current government guidance distinguishes between the clinically extremely vulnerable and the clinically vulnerable. So individuals in the former category are advised not to work outside the home. So this would include people with severe respiratory conditions, certain cancers, immunosuppressed illnesses. Those basically who've been advised by their clinician or had a letter from the government to stay at home. This may mean that certain members of staff are not able to return in June. So schools must respect this, as it's obviously integral to that individual's safety, and you will need to identify those members of staff at an early stage discuss the position with the employee, and consider how and if they can work from home. So you could put them on the remote education side of things. Alternatively, of course, shielding employees can also be furloughed at the moment under the coronavirus job retention scheme. Clinically vulnerable individuals, as opposed to the clinically extremely vulnerable individuals, are at higher risk of illness, but they've been advised just to take extra care when out and about and observing social distancing. So where possible, they should work from home, but if they are out and about, then they just need to be careful, essentially. So you will need to discuss with any vulnerable staff whether they're comfortable about returning to work, and take steps to address the risks for those who don't. And that includes people who are pregnant as well. So it could include considering the provision of PPE in certain circumstances. You may want to ask occupational health for some input, and it might be that medical guidance from that individual's GP is also advisable in some circumstances. If appropriate, it may be again that these people can carry out some remote or support remotely, carry out lesson planning, or any other roles that can be done from home, particularly in the short term anyway. In all cases, I just recommend that you assess, discuss the risks with them, reassure them that you are following the government guidance, you're taking appropriate steps, and importantly, document those discussions. And what about employees with vulnerable family members at home? I know we've had a couple of questions on this one as well. Such employees may understandably be concerned about returning to work. You do have the option of furloughing staff whilst the scheme remains in force, or alternatively, these staff could work from home again. Staff could also talk about taking some leave, annual leave if that's possible, or dependent leave to assist them during the adjustment period. Talk to them again about their concerns and the options available, and ideally seek a mutually agreeable way forward. Some staff may not be able to return to work as soon as planned if they've got children who are not yet back at school, or they've got other caring responsibilities. It is likely that wider members of your family will not be able to help at the moment with childcare in the present circumstances. We're not quite yet at that bubble stage that they keep talking about. I must say I'm looking forward to that stage. This therefore may mean that staff have to work variable hours, possibly for the remainder of this term, or until schools return to normal for everybody. Again, communication is key. You have the option of furloughing staff with caring responsibilities. That is in the guidance, whilst the scheme remains in force, or alternatively, if appropriate, these staff could work from home. Again, annual leave, dependence leave, even parental leave are further options you could consider during the adjustment period. Keep a record of all of these decisions, all of these discussions, and the rationale as well for them, because care must be taken to avoid any conscious or unconscious discrimination in your decision making. We are aware that teaching unions are hostile, shall we say, about the reopening of schools, and that the unions have been in contact with their members to encourage them not to engage in discussions about the reopening of schools until they advise further. This is clearly unhelpful and may lead to staff refusing to return. Talk to your staff. Take the time to discuss concerns with the member of staff and determine whether there are any particular vulnerabilities or risks that the employee is concerned about that could be addressed before they come back. It is important to reassure staff about what you're doing, talk to them about the steps that you've taken and the provisions you've put in place. And just make sure that they know that you're doing everything you can to make it a safe environment in which they can work. Ultimately, staff have a contractual obligation to provide services to the school, and so it could be a disciplinary issue if a member of staff is refusing to return. Of course, each case will need to be treated on a case-by-case basis, so we would suggest that you take some advice if you are faced with these circumstances. Next slide. I'm now going to just mention a few further staff issues which I think schools are probably going to come across a little bit on the reopening next month. So the first one is annual leave. Annual leave continues to accrue whilst on furlough, and it is likely that schools will have requests, particularly from support staff, who want to take their annual leave as soon as the school reopens which of course is likely to be very inconvenient for you when you're trying to sort out the staffing. You can refuse a request, but you must give as much notice as the amount of leave requested. So if somebody's requesting a week off, then you need to give them a week's notice that they can't take that leave. But you've obviously got to be careful not to prevent an employee from taking their leave, their statutory leave altogether. Employees can take leave whilst on furlough, and that won't bring the period of furlough to an end. And the new guidance last night suggests that employers can require workers to take holiday, although it does note that the employer has to consider whether the restrictions that the worker's under, such as the need to socially distance, for example, would prevent the worker from resting, relaxing, and enjoying leisure time. So we do need to be a bit careful about doing that. Sickness management is likely to be more time consuming over the coming months. It will be important to remind staff of the school's policies regarding sickness, and more importantly than ever, you'll need to emphasise the don't come to work if you're feeling unwell rule. Until we have a vaccine or a cure for COVID, there is going to be an absolute need for schools to ensure they monitor staff sickness with symptoms, timings, that sort of detail, and if appropriate, communicate to others where there is a risk. As you probably know, a staff member who develops coronavirus should be sent, or symptoms compatible with the disease should be sent home and self-isolate for 7 days. The government guidance provides further details on the school's obligations in this regard. Access to testing, of course, is also available. Flexible working requests. Well, we think there could be an influx of flexible working requests when the schools reopen, as staff have got very used to working from home and in some cases working variable hours. Schools should have a flexible working policy and should ideally follow this when dealing with any request for flexible working from staff. As you may be aware, applications for flexible working can only be refused if one of the 8 prescribed grounds applies. So, for example, an inability to reorganise work among existing staff if you were to accept the request, or the burden of additional costs. What I'd say is it's important to be consistent. A lack of consistency in approach towards workers requesting different working arrangements could constitute discrimination. In particular, I'm thinking about disability discrimination, age discrimination in the current circumstances. But if in doubt, schools should take advice when an application is received. In reality, we suggest that you just consider requests sensibly and practically. It may be that some flexible working arrangements can be agreed with staff temporarily so that we don't need to make any permanent changes. Similarly, schools may see a rise in grievances being raised. ACAS has produced actually some quite useful guidance for employers on handling disciplinary and grievance processes during the coronavirus crisis. So I would urge you to have a look at that if you are dealing with a grievance process or a disciplinary process at this time. For example, it does contain quite useful tips on carrying out investigations or hearings while an employee is on furlough, for example. I think whistleblowing is also likely to be an issue. Raising a concern relating to health and safety is in most circumstances likely to constitute a protected disclosure for the purposes of whistleblowing, provided the concerns were of course raised in compliance with the relevant requirements of the Employment Rights Act. I did have one client contact me yesterday who'd received a letter from a member of staff citing health and safety concerns, so we're having to deal with that one quite carefully. And we need to be conscious of the well-being of all staff, including our senior leaders, and the need to implement flexible working practices in a way that promotes the good work-life balance and supports teachers in their return. As a minimum, you'll need to follow your usual processes for supporting staff welfare. Perhaps you should issue a reminder as well of the support available ahead of their return to work. While deaths from COVID are still comparatively rare, it is possible that you could have employees who have suffered a bereavement in the family. So while there is no statutory right to bereavement leave, other than in the case of the death of a child, which of course was brought in April, we suggest that you should be sympathetic to people in those circumstances and allow them some additional time off during this period. And if you can afford to do so, to at least temporarily pay them in full. Next slide. So schools should continue to consider their financial viability and staffing requirements as the months go on, and I'm sure you're all doing that already. If workloads have decreased significantly and are unlikely to pick up in the short term, perhaps due to a decline in pupil numbers, then cost-saving measures are likely to be necessary. Schools can continue to take advantage of the coronavirus job retention scheme to save costs, and as Chrissy said, the F word, as we all now know it. This week it's been confirmed that the scheme will be extended until the end of October 2020, which is an interesting development. Up until the end of July, what we do know is that the scheme is not going to change, but from the start of August, furloughed workers will be able to return to work part-time. So we understand that employers will have to pay or be asked to pay a percentage towards the salaries of their furloughed staff at this stage. The employer payments will substitute the contribution the government's currently making, ensuring that staff continue to receive the 80% or up to £2,500 a month. Full details are due to be distributed or to be available by the end of May, and of course we will be issuing a full update to schools at that time. It could be possible to furlough teaching staff for July and August as a means of saving costs, so it is something that's worth considering. But practically, you'll need to have a look and check your furlough letter that you've sent out to your individual employees to see if it included a specific end date and a specific percentage salary payment. If you wish to continue to keep staff furloughed on the same terms as the extended scheme, then you may need to reach further agreement with them to accept the continuance of furlough and the new payment. It is also worth thinking about anything you can do in terms of reducing costs without actually reducing headcount. So I'm sure a lot of you have thought about some of these already, but pay reductions, pay freezes, unpaid leave, or even consider redeployment of staff to busier areas of the school. To implement any of these options, you will need to obtain the employee's consent to vary their terms and conditions, most likely on a temporary basis, to avoid the risk of any breach of contract claims, unpaid wages claims, constructive unfair dismissal claims. In most cases where the alternative is redundancy, an employee is likely to accept the change. And finally, inevitably, schools are likely to have to consider redundancies. If redundancies are a consideration, you will need to consider the number of dismissals proposed and whether or not it triggers collective consultation obligations. Redundancy has a wider meaning in this context and covers situations in which employers are proposing to change terms and conditions by way of a dismissal and re-engagement. So this would apply, for example, in a consultation process with teaching staff over a potential withdrawal from the TPS. So that could also be a cost saving for you to consider at the moment, but of course that's a matter for a whole other day. Consultation must start in good time to allow the relevant discussions to take place, and there are minimum periods before the first of the dismissals can take effect. So the minimum period is 30 days, we're looking at 20 but less than 100 dismissals within a 90-day period, and 45 where we're looking at over 100 dismissals in a 90-day period. There are heavy penalties if you get this wrong. It can be very, very costly to employers. The highest protective award in an employment tribunal is 90 days gross pay per employee. Plus there are also the added unfair dismissal claims that would inevitably ensue. When thinking about timings and redundancies, you'll also need to consider and factor in contractual notice periods. That could be costly financially if notice has not been issued in time. So it may be that now you've actually missed the deadline for notice for it to expire in time for September. Well, that's all I wanted to cover today. There is plenty more I could say, but unfortunately we don't have enough time today. But I'll hand you back over to Chrissy.
Great, thank you very much, Rach, for that. I realise and appreciate that a lot of this has only come out in the last few days, so particularly in relation to furlough. We've had a couple of questions in that I'll just want to mention now. We've obviously got a Q&A session at the end. One of them is about this payment during the summer holidays. So if you're furloughing staff, can you furlough staff over the summer holidays? And if so, you know, what are the risks of that?
With respect to schools furloughing staff for July and August, we anticipate that in principle that's going to be possible, subject to, of course, your contract, and understand it could be of interest to many people as a means of saving costs and reducing the possibility of having to make salary cuts or redundancies. With regards to the payment, I don't think you necessarily have to pay 100% during this time. It obviously depends on your contract, but you could get some negative backlash, shall we say, if you don't. So you will, I'd say, need to think about the PR aspect and also, staff morale at this time.
Thanks, Rach. Thanks, Rach. I appreciate that, because obviously everyone in schools is pulling together at the moment and doing a sterling job. Just one question that's come in, Richard Flower. Good morning, Richard. Do we have to pay staff who could attend work but refuse to do so? So do they have to be paid?
Well, I think it does depend on the circumstances, because as I said in my discussions, we have to talk to that member of staff first. I understand why they don't want to come in. If it is purely a matter of them saying, I just don't want to come in, then that's that there is a question mark over whether or not they have to be paid, because they have a contractual duty to provide a service to the school. And if they're refusing to do so, then technically we don't need to pay them. That said, I would, as I say, recommend that you have that conversation with them. You understand what their concerns are about why they don't want to return. And I think, as I mentioned before, it could be a disciplinary issue if they are simply refusing and they've got no good reason as to why they are refusing. The problem is, in many circumstances, I think you'll find that people will be anxious about coming back. So we do need to just be mindful of that.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Rach. Lots more questions for you at the end, I'm sure. Just as an aside, if anyone has colleagues that are trying to get into the webinar, for some reason we can't seem to get everyone in, we're trying to fix it, but in any event, the webinar is being recorded. And if you would like us to run a follow-up Q&A session, perhaps at a further date, then let us know. We'd be more than happy to do that. So moving on, we're now going to look at issues of data protection, remote learning and exams, dreaded exams. So I'm delighted to introduce my colleague, Paul Watkins. Many of you will have seen Paul at the ISBA annual conference. He's an education lawyer in our team with a particular expertise in data protection. Over to you, Paul.
Thank you very much, Chrissy. And I'm going to start off by talking about recording lessons. Some schools are recording lessons, others aren't. So what is the correct approach? Most schools that do make recordings are doing it either for safeguarding reasons or to be able to accommodate pupils with specific needs. So for instance, pre-recording lessons for international pupils who may be in different time zones. So the DfE guidance that was published on the 19th of April relates to remote learning, and it did provide this level of flexibility for schools. There is no expectation that teachers should live stream or pre-record videos. Instead, schools would need to consider the approach that best suits the needs of their pupils and staff during this time. And aside from recording lessons, there are many other options that schools consider, and I'm sure some of you have already considered this already. So things like reporting routes for pupils to raise concerns when they're online, using school registered accounts, auditing the settings of who can start or join a live stream or video, having a behaviour policy on how to conduct lessons, so that would include what to wear and where to have them, and if possible, having another member of staff or adult present. But if you do go down the route of recording lessons, it's really important to keep data protection in mind, because those recordings are likely to be capturing a lot of personal data of teachers, perhaps of pupils who are participating in the lessons, and also people who aren't participating in the lessons. So comments made by those participants about others. So it's really important to be transparent with staff and pupils if their data is captured on how you handle those recordings. Have a look at your privacy notice. Does it cover recording lessons? And if not, does it need to be updated? Or perhaps an easier option at this time is to send a communication with this further information to all relevant individuals. So what other steps can you take to protect those recordings? We'll try to only capture relevant data on the subject matter being taught. It's difficult to manage as there are many lessons that are taking place, I'm sure, every week, but being clear on staff expectations is really important. So having a staff behaviour policy that includes this. Retain those recordings for no longer than necessary. So set a retention period, and that period might not be very long if it's your intention to only use this during this public health emergency, and also have appropriate security measures to keep those recordings confidential, perhaps by using a platform which doesn't allow pupils to download those recordings on personal devices. So it's really important to keep your decision to record and your other options under review, because clearly the situation is changing all the time, and the needs of your pupils and staff will also change. So moving on to the next slide, and this is all about exams data. And as we speak, I'm sure many teachers are having to discuss centigrades and rankings for their GCSE and A-level pupils. So in data protection terms, this means, again, the creation of lots of new personal data. And pupils will have a right to see this data, although not before the results are published. Ofqual consulted on the appeals process for pupils unhappy with their awarded grades last month. And the current thinking is that academic judgments of teachers will not be appealable, but we're not too sure about whether that will be the case. But whatever the process will look like, we are expecting an increase in the number of subject access requests for this information, so that pupils can see those academic judgments, and it might inform their decisions on whether to sit exams in the autumn or indeed next year. So if and when you do receive a subject access request for exam data, the key consideration is timing. If that request is made before the day that results are published, schools can and should take advantage of an extension under the GDPR to the usual 1 month deadline for a response. So instead of 1 month, the deadline becomes 40 days after the results are published. On the other hand, if the request is made after results are published, then we'll need to deal with that within the usual 1 month deadline. So what do we need to bear in mind when we actually deal with those requests? Firstly is the usual rule that it's the pupil who must make the request if it covers their personal data. A parent can only make the request on the pupil's behalf where you have the pupil's consent. Attempts to anonymise those discussions about centigrades, such as using descriptors like pupil A or pupil's initials, are unlikely to succeed in making it non-personal, and actually might unnecessarily confuse teachers going through this process. So it is really important to be prepared to release that information and keep all those discussions professional, regardless of where they take place. So there might be some discussions that are held on personal devices or on WhatsApp, and it's important to remain professional in those circumstances as well. And finally, think about your filing systems. How can you easily access this exam data come August and September, when you may receive a number of requests for it? And finally, on to the next slide. This is a few considerations in relation to other data protection matters. Firstly, remote working. And this may happen a bit less during the phased return from June, but it will remain for schools. And of course, data protection is not a barrier to remote working. The key is to have the same level of security of that data that you would have on school premises, but also to think about the particular risks associated with working from home. And particularly during the phased return, there might be a bit more movement of data, particularly hard copy documents between school site and home. So it's important to think about whether that's necessary, and if it is, what security you can put in place to keep it secure. And also, of course, when working from home, there's an increasing use of personal devices. Again, data protection law doesn't prevent the use of personal devices, but schools should have clear policy on that, and measures that might be included in that policy include encrypting all those devices where they are used for work, using the most up-to-date version of any platform to access staff systems, and use of complex and unique and complex passwords. So the usual considerations. Just to mention phishing attacks, they are on the rise at the moment. These are emails that attempt to trick people into clicking a bad link that will download malware or direct them to an unsecure website. And it's increasingly being used as part of the chat function on video calls such as Zoom. The National Cybersecurity Centre's guidance provides some useful tips on how organisations can defend themselves from such attacks. So I would recommend taking a look at that. And just a final point on the regulator's approach. So the ICO has published a document last month on this very issue, and their approach has changed. The key message really from that is their approach is one of now pragmatism and proportionality. After all, they are stretched as much as other organisations are. What this means in reality is that they will be focusing on the most serious challenges and greatest threats to the public. Their frontline advice to support organisations will continue. So they have created a coronavirus hub with some very useful information. And again, I would recommend schools to take a look at that. So it's certainly a welcome approach, and it takes into account the realities that we are all living with. So on that positive note, I pass back to Chrissy.
Thank you very much, Paul. That was really comprehensive. I can see we've had some specific data protection questions in. I'll leave those until the Q&A, so you've got a time to look at them. But I just wanted to take on the general approach of the ICO as a regulator generally. I mean, how are they in terms of coming back to schools on issues like compliance with timescales, etc.?
Yeah, so they clearly they can't extend statutory deadlines to respond to subject access requests, but they are being really helpful in terms of advising members of the public through their usual communication channels that they may need to wait a bit longer than usual to hear from organisations. So it's a really pragmatic approach. And to be honest, I'm not too surprised by the ICO's approach during this pandemic, because they are they are well known for being a pragmatic regulator.
Thank you, Paul. Thank you very much. Right, so moving swiftly on, we have got a Q&A session at the end, so please do keep those questions coming in. We will do our best to answer them, but I know that Rach and Paul will now be scrolling through those. So I am now going to look very briefly at education issues, starting with safeguarding. Now, what I had intended to cover has all changed. As I said at the outset, when we set this date, we thought about June, but we had no idea that the 1st of June was actually going to be this wider opening. Quick review of safeguarding generally before focusing very much on the latest guidance issued this week. So government guidance on safeguarding and Covid-19 was first published around the end of March. That is applicable until the 31st of May, and that's still in place. We know that that's going to be reviewed on or before the 1st of June. It's probably happened this morning and I've not realised yet, but that is the current guidance that you must refer to on safeguarding specifically and supplementing your safeguarding policy. Helpfully, that guidance recognises that the way in which schools are operating in response to this crisis is fundamentally different to business as usual. So that's helpful. Having said that, some safeguarding principles remain the same. And that's when you're thinking about risk assessments and the next steps that you're going to be taking, have this in mind. So the best interests of the children must always continue to come first. So that's one really important factor when you're thinking about risk assessments. And secondly, and it goes back to what Paul was saying, children should continue to be protected when they are online. So as we are going to have remote learning for some considerable time yet, certainly for some certain year groups, that is everything that Paul was saying is very, very important. So if, like me, you have received updates for the DFE and feeling slightly overwhelmed, it's very easy to miss new guidance. So I just wanted to highlight that on the 12th of May, so on Tuesday this week, they issued guidance headed, I've got a copy here, Initial Planning Framework for Schools in England. That talks a little bit about action points for safeguarding, so please have a look at that. We will send that out as a link afterwards. That's quite a helpful document. So in terms of your risk assessment, I can confirm that there's an FAQs to follow from my colleague Kamal, who's a partner in our regulatory team on health and safety. Schools should consult with staff, possibly their trade union reps, about their risk assessments. And if there are more than 50 employees, then because it's COVID risk assessment, you will be required to publish this. Again, more detail on that. It's likely you'll want to provide some of that information to parents, possibly. So you identify your risk. COVID, of course, is a risk in itself. That, coupled with safeguarding, gives rise for opportunities for abuse, whether that's through the learning environment, whether that's through the child being at home, not having access to pastoral support, anxiety, stress, so on and so forth. And as lockdown begins to ease, you need to reassess those safeguarding risks within a different school day, if that makes sense. It's very clear that we're not returning to full-time provision for those coming back on the 1st of June, possibly, and that some year groups will not return at all this academic year. So look at your, you know the risk, look at your existing policies, assess the risk, review it and mitigate where you can. So now we're going to move on to the next slide to look at current issues. I'm happy to take questions on safeguarding if anybody has any. So first step, please read the guidance, the latest guidance. So there were 3 sets of government guidance issued on the 11th of May and 1 on the 12th that are relevant to schools. The first set is for parents and carers. That's helpful, but not as helpful as the wider opening document for schools, and also, and my favourite piece of guidance, implementing protective measures. That's really, really helpful. Guidance, I think, is really well written and includes a number of factors for you to consider as part of your risk assessment. And so one of the things you should be thinking about is going through that guidance. So about 12 pages long, so it's not onerous, it's not 60 pages. Take into account your school's own individual circumstances when you're conducting that process. So, and I could see me if I'd asked a question about my next point, can we be forced to open the schools? So we have been asked by schools, can the government order us to reopen? So they can, it's possible, but it's unlikely. So the government guidance, to put this in context, to close and to stay open for children of key workers and vulnerable children if you could, was guidance only. So the government, or the Secretary of State, has the power under the Coronavirus Act to issue a direction to compel schools to close. That was not needed. The schools complied with the guidance, and so no direction was issued. Excuse me. So if you carry out your risk assessment and you decide to stay closed, or, for example, you might decide just to open year 1 or just year 6, or whatever that might be, you might have to justify that to parents. And there's clearly a difference between a school that's in the centre of a very busy city to a rural setting. So the government guidance to reopen is guidance only. You must be guided by your own risk assessment in deciding whether to remain closed to certain year groups and how and when to open. So the second question we've been asked is, can we open the school for additional year groups? So currently it's reception year 1 and year 6. Now, it is possible, but in my view, strongly, and I can't say any more than that, inadvisable for the following reasons. And I know there's lots of independent schools here, and so I'm really talking to you about this. So the 3 sets of guidance that were issued on the 11th of May, on Monday, there was only one mention of independent schools specifically. And that's in the document headed Prepare for Wider Opening for Schools. And it's under the section about year groups in the first phase of wider opening. And it says, and I'm going to read it to you, we expect all mainstream schools and colleges, including independent schools, to follow the same approach. And it talks about national parity. So it's very clear that the government intended it just to be those year groups, and they've named independent schools only in that bit of the guidance. So, and my fear is that if you do look at opening other year groups, there could be a negative backlash in the same way that people gathering in parks or other things as part of the recent lockdown shouldn't possibly, it was looked on with horror by some, wasn't it? So there could be that negative backlash from others. So my advice would be to stay inside the guidance. It's a PR issue as much as anything else. It could also have the effect of increasing pressure from parents in other year groups to open other specific years. And secondly, I suppose the other reason for not wanting to open those additional year groups not specified in the guidance at this stage, the government, as I've already mentioned, under the Coronavirus Act, they can issue a direction to force a school to close. And so the government could do that. And obviously there are PR issues surrounding that. So if I was a governor in a school, I'd want to be aware of that significant risk. And I understand the concern that for a number of schools that we look after, that your transition year is year 8, it's not year 6, because it talks about the transition year in the guidance. So I understand that difficulty, but I don't think I can say it any stronger than that. For pupils with SEND and learning difficulties, separate guidance was issued for supporting vulnerable children in April. That guidance still applies at the moment, but it is picked up in the risk assessment in the guidance I've referred to. It's very clear that local authorities must work with schools, families and the young person dependent on age to judge whether their needs are best met at home or in the classroom. It goes back to that risk assessment about safeguarding what is in the best interest of that child. So with a wider opening of schools, and that child may already be in school or they may be at home, but if they're already in school, I'd suggest that you probably have to reassess that risk assessment if you're bringing more pupils in. And I would suggest that the school conducts an individual assessment for each child with learning support needs and document that. So I'm going to move on to my third and final slide. And I'm going to start off with class sizes. And I can see there's been a question on this. And I shared on LinkedIn this morning a really interesting BBC report about schools in Denmark that have opened. It's on the BBC website if you want to take a look. So the guidance implementing protective measures, my favourite one, refers to class sizes of no more than 15 and 1 teacher. And I think it's important, obviously that number's probably been chosen because it splits a typical state school class of 30 into 2. But you could have 3 classes of 8, 2 classes of 10. It doesn't have to be 15, it's up to 15. And the reason, what they're trying to do when you read that guidance is attempt to ensure, where possible, that they only mix in a small, consistent group, excuse me, and that small group stays away from other people. So it's not so much about social distancing. So yes, I know it's quite difficult to social distance a 4 or 5-year-old. They want to hug everybody, and there's an element of social distancing, excuse me, and they should obviously try and stay away from others, but it's actually about having a tight single unit, rather like, a little group of ducklings or hurrying around together, that stay together from day to day and they don't intermix with others. Excuse me, I'm just going to have a drink. So for year 6 and possibly for year 1 actually, it's highly likely they might have specialist subject teachers, and the guidance says that schools should ensure the same teacher and other staff are assigned to each group, and as far as possible they stay with them throughout that day and on subsequent days. However, the guidance does say that for secondary schools and colleges there will be specialist rotation of staff. So you could apply that to a prep school as well. So as part of your risk assessment, for year 6 or possibly year 1, you would look at those specialist teachers and consider that would form part of your risk assessment. Under the section planning and preparation, please use the protective measures guidance that I've mentioned, because that's got a whole list of questions that will really feed into your risk assessment, and also the framework guidance that was issued on the 12th. The key actions in that as part of your risk assessment talks about staggering groups, break times, drop-offs and pickups, etc., etc. If you're a boarding school or you have international students, I'm aware that the Boarding Schools Association are working very hard to questions about quarantine, international students returning, visas, PPE, etc. So watch that space for updates from the BSA. I'm sure there'll be a lot more to come on that. Parents wishing to keep children at home. We've had quite a few questions from schools about this, because schools have been trying to gauge parent interest in take-up to see what they should be opening. And of course, it might be that you don't open on the 1st of June. You could have a staff sort of mini inset day on that first day back, and then open, a couple of days later. So some parents might not be willing to send their children back to school. If the parent wishes to keep their child at home, it's clear there's no penalty for non-attendance. But once again, consider any concerns you may have. It goes back to that safeguarding and risk assessment. So what is in the best interest of that child to keep them safe? You might have to consider a mix of remote learning, a hybrid classroom, to consider the needs of those who are unable or unwilling to come in. Remote learning for younger pupils is tricky. It involves a lot of parental engagement. What was interesting from the Denmark schools report this morning on BBC News was actually there were some parents that were reluctant to come in, but over a few weeks they were coming in. The key obviously is communication. I just want to pick up on complaints and a bit of the regulatory aspect, the ISI and Ofsted, if you're inspected by Ofsted approach. So if a parent raises a concern about anything that you're doing as part of this wider opening or the remote provision, you have to consider how to deal with it in accordance with your normal processes. We speak to the ISI. They are mindful and very alive to the fact that schools are operating under different circumstances, and their approach so far has been very sensible and pragmatic, taking the view that schools are doing the best that they can in the circumstances that we're faced with. The Secretary of State under the Coronavirus Act has the power to issue directions, as I've mentioned, about closing or opening, but also directions amending or disapplying regulations, and that includes the ISSRs, the Independent School Standards. And I believe there are discussions that are ongoing about this, and they are alive to this issue. So I'd kind of put that to one mind. If I was running a school, they're not expecting you to put the full curriculum on at the present time. So I hope that's a useful summary. That's a real fly through for me. As Rach said, we will be issuing some guidance on health and safety requirements over the next day or two. I now want to look at questions, and by the miracle of technology, I hope I've got Rach and Paul on the screen in front of me. So going to some questions. Paul, there was a really good question about Year 6 test results. So the children are 10 and 11 years old. We get that quite a lot, don't we, where the parents asking for the child. What's your view on the response there?
Yeah, it's that sort of cusp age where schools are not too sure whether the parent can make the request or whether it has to be the child. And it's really, there is no age in data protection law where an individual can exercise their data rights. The data does belong to the child, but it's really important to take a pragmatic view, and some schools do have a policy really for practical reasons where they say that the request normally does have to come from the parent as well, but it's also important really to look at the individual circumstances and whether that child has the maturity to make that request themselves.
Great, thank you very much, Paul. That's really clear. And I know you get that quite a lot. Paul deals with a lot of subject access requests, so is very familiar with that sort of work. Rach, one for you now, face masks. What if the member of staff insists on wearing, whether it's a face covering or a face mask, and doesn't want to come into school unless that's provided for them? What should the response be from the school?
Yeah, well, as I've said, I think I've repeated myself quite a few times, you need to talk to the member of staff, understand why they are concerned and why they want to wear the face coverings. Now, my view is that we shouldn't allow it if we're looking at that teacher teaching a class of 4-year-olds, for example, because I think that it would do more harm than good. And I think as a parent, I don't know what you think, Chrissy, but as a parent, I wouldn't like the idea of my child going into school with a teacher and a face covering over them whilst they are teaching my child. I think it would scare the children quite significantly. So it might be that you have to talk to that member of staff about staying away if they are really concerned about coming to work without a face covering, and perhaps carry out some remote learning or do as much as they can from home.
Thanks very much, Rach. Yeah, I know it's a question we've been asked quite a lot, isn't it, in the last week or so, particularly. Leslie, I'm going to try and answer your question. Leslie, you've asked, good morning, Leslie, you've asked about wraparound care and grouping key worker children together at the end of the day. Again, this is going back to the risk assessment. The government guidance is really clear that the reason that children are grouped together is to keep them in that tight single unit. So they don't want them mixing. So even at break times, play times, and when they're socialising, that they should be in those tight-knit groups separated out. So I think if we were bringing other children or grouping other children together in some other way for key worker children, could possibly do that. But once again, you'd have to have them in that tight-knit group. So that would form part of your risk assessment as anything else. If you have been providing support for key worker children and vulnerable children, communicate with the parents. So if you're thinking of changing the way you've been doing something, then of course, as long as a parent generally is told in advance what's happening, they've got time to assimilate it. Obviously, if the child comes home and says, oh, today I played with so-and-so, gosh, that's my doorbell, sorry. One of the children can get it. That's one of the risks, isn't it? That actually it's upsetting a parent. So it's like everything, communicate with parents. I can see we've got another question on data. Privacy notices, Paul. So there's a question about amending your privacy notice. So should a school have a supplementary privacy notice on lesson recording, for example? Is that something that you'd recommend?
Yes, I touched on this. There are two main options. So you can either have update your current privacy notice and just have a look through each section and see whether anything needs to be updated, and of course keeping the language clear and concise and similar to the language in your privacy notice. But then the other option, which might be better for schools at this time, rather than going back into your document, is perhaps sending a communication out to members of staff if it's just a pre-recorded lesson which only contains the staff data, or potentially to pupils as well if their data is being recorded, and there you can have just a summary really of the information you would have in your privacy notice anyway. So why you're making the recording, what security measures you have in place, what's your retention period, and similar things.
Yeah, that makes sense. Quite practical, isn't it? But you haven't got to spell everything out. You can have it quite generic, I think.
Yes, so it's really what works best for your school.
Yeah. I can see one of the questions is about year 10 and 12, and I didn't mention them because, I mean, we could have had an hour on furlough, an hour on data and exams, and subject access, and an hour on the new guidance. And if you do want us to have another webinar, if that would be helpful, or just a general Q&A, we're delighted to do that. More than happy to do that for you. So year 10 and 12, I didn't mention those. There is an indication that they're going to be the next group. They want some face-to-face contact. And of course, what you've got to remember is this guidance is written for all schools, so state and independent. And of course, state schools will be going on till possibly 17th of July, possibly the early, 21st, 24th of July in different parts of England. And so you could, if after say 3 weeks, year 10 and year 12 can come back, so from say the 24th of June, you could get them back in for a month. Now, of course, that won't be full-time provision. It's really clear that actually what the government are envisaging from this guidance is not coming in and doing a normal school day. So actually for some of those students, they might just come in for a little bit or half a day, depending on your risk assessment, and the rest of the time is remote learning. We know that the government are very concerned about next year's exams, so year 10 and year 12s, and obviously that's why they've been highlighted within the guidance, because they're GCSEs and A-levels next year. So you can do that. Now for independent schools, you might finish at the end of June, so it might be just a period of a week or possibly the first week of July. So again, talk to your parents, talk about what they want to do, and again, you'll still have to do small groups if that's what you're doing, which you generally have for A-levels anyway. GCSEs might be slightly more tricky, and some sort of social distancing. So that's something. And obviously, I think all of that is dependent upon the younger children going back. So it's still a little bit of a watch this space, really. Rach, now I'm going to ask you a question here. I saw another question on collective consultation. If you're kind of rotating staff, aren't you? I mean, how does that, do you have to consult with staff about that? Can you swap staff in? How do you think that might work in practice?
Are you talking about a collective consultation process? I think that's what the question's sort of getting at. Run a collective consultation process if you've got some people in, some people out, all of that sort of stuff. You've just got to do the best that you can in the circumstance. So obviously you'd have to elect employee representatives, which would be the first thing to do, and now that's going to be more difficult in the current circumstances, so you'll just have to make arrangements for people to be nominated. People can email perhaps nominations in, look at how you can then carry out that process. And then you would still have those employee representatives. Now, people who are on furlough can be employee representatives, that's been clarified, so that's still a possibility. And then you could then set up, as you say in the question, I think, Zoom meetings, other or similar meetings with those employee representatives to consult with them about the proposals. And then obviously those employee representatives would need to go away and set up their own meetings with those members of staff. But you can do it remotely. It is possible. You don't need to not and wait until everybody's back in school, because a lot of these processes just need to be initiated as soon as possible.
Thank you, Rach. And I know that that's a question that we've had, which was submitted beforehand, about if a staff member is unwell. We've had another question online about if they've got symptoms and what should they be doing. If a staff member has symptoms or suspects that they should go home as they are currently at the moment.
Yes, they should go home and they should self-isolate for 7 days. And I think I've seen another question there about if they test positive, what do we do about the other teachers or other members of staff or other children they've been in contact with? And the guidance does suggest that potentially the other people, the other children and the other members of staff within that group that they've been in should be then sent home, unfortunately, if they have tested positive.
Thank you. Yes, that's helpful. Thank you, Rach. I can see people talking about nurseries. Yes, nurseries are. I've not talked about nurseries. We'll probably have a separate nurseries webinar, I think, because they are separate in themselves. And I've had a question about what needs to be published and where. That will be covered in our health and safety FAQs, which is being produced by my colleague Kamal. Should be out today. If not, it will be tomorrow. We will send you all a link to that afterwards. Now, we've come up to the end of our hour, and but we've got a number of questions still to answer. So what we will do is we will put those in an FAQs. We will answer each and every one of them where we can, and we will send that out to you. And if you do want us to hold another webinar or event like this, if it's helpful, then just ask us, because we are trying to support the sector as much as we can. So from all of us here at HCR, thank you very much for your engagement today and your involvement. It's great to have your questions. It's good to see you. Know so many familiar faces are there. Our next webinar is on the 21st of May, next Thursday, and I can see we've had one question about fees. So next Thursday, we will be looking at commercial issues, including business interruption insurance, fee recovery, particularly fees for the summer term and for next term, parent contract. And we're delighted at that event. We're going to be joined by John Murphy of the ISBA. He's doing a slot for us on current issues and the next year going forward. And John will also be joining us for our Q&A session. So I'm really delighted that he's coming along. Any other topics you wish us to cover, please get in touch. We very much value your input. Thank you very much once again. If we can help at all, get in touch. I wish you good health to you, those in your families and schools. The work you're doing is amazing and we are very proud to be part of this sector. So it's time to say farewell and thank you for your support. Thank you.
Thank you.